Witam wszystkich bardzo serdecznie. Jestem rabinką
Hello,
Miriam
everyone.
Klimova
I am
z
Rabbi
Haify.
Miriam Klimova from Haifa,
Dzisiaj
and we
kontynuujemy
continue
nasze
our
studiowanie
studies into
historii
the
żydowskiej,
Jewish
historii
history,
narodu
the
żydowskiego na
history
podstawie
of the
książki
Jewish people based
Turning
on the book
Points
Turning
in Jewish
Points of
History.
Jewish History.
Mówimy
We are
o najważniejszych
discussing the
wydarzeniach
most
historii
important
żydowskiej.
events of the
Ale
Jewish
zwracając się do
history.
tego
Today we'll
tematu
be talking
dzisiejszego,
about
reforma
Reform
i
Judaism and
reformowanie,
the reaction to
reakcja na
it.
reformę, postanowiłam, że ten temat
And
wymaga
I decided
od
that
nas trochę
this
bardziej
topic
skoncentrowania, trochę więcej
requires
czasu.
more time,
Więc
and we
tematem
need
będzie
to
podzielony na
focus
kilka
more on
wykładów,
it. So we'll be
ponieważ z
dividing
jednej
this into
strony
a
nie da
couple
się
of
w jednym
lectures because
wykładzie
one lecture
opowiedzieć
is not
całą
enough
historię
time to
reformy. Z
cover the
drugiej
whole
strony
history of reform.
myślę, że
And
bardzo ciężko
also,
znaleźć
it's
źródła
difficult to
prawdziwe
find
na ten
actual
temat,
sources about
ponieważ
this
jeżeli
topic.
mówimy o Torze, mówimy
Because
o
if we talk
różnych
about
historiach
the
biblijnych,
Torah, about different
wiele
biblical
ludzi
stories, many
opowiadają
people
o nich,
talk
wielu
about it,
ludzi
they
dyskutują
discuss them,
i
they
robią
give
swoje
their
interpretacje.
interpretations.
Jeżeli mówimy o
But
reformie,
if we
to
talk about
niestety nadal temat
Reform
ten jest,
Judaism, for
powiedzmy,
example,
grany
in Israel,
politycznie
is
w
still a
świecie
political
z jednej strony
topic.
przyjmowany,
In some
ale gdzieś tam daleko
places
na
around the
zachodzie
world, is still
mniej możliwie w
accepted.
Europie, w której się narodził.
So we talked
Więc
about
mówiąc
reform
o
during the previous
reformie,
lecture. We talked
zrobiliśmy
about
wykład
emancipation,
poprzedni,
and now we are in a
który
new
był
era of
poświęcony
Aharonim, so the last
emancypacji. Jeżeli mówimy o czasie,
creators. This is the
to
era of
jesteśmy w
Haskalah, of Jewish
czasie nowym,
enlightenment.
w epoce Achoronim, ostatnich
So, what
tworzycieli,
was
w epoce
emancipation for
Haskali,
the Jewish
oświecenia
people, for
boskiego.
Jewish tradition?
Kiedy mówiliśmy
That's what we
o
discussed. We talked about the
tym,
person
czym
who
była
initiated the
emancypacja dla narodu
changes,
żydowskiego, dla
and
tradycji
we
żydowskiej.
mentioned
Mówiliśmy o tym,
Moses
kto
Mendelssohn.
był człowiekiem, który zapoczątkował te
Mendelssohn
zmiany.
was
To
trying to tell
wtedy
us that living in
wspomnieliśmy
both
o
worlds,
Mosze
so
Mendelssohnie.
in the Jewish world, in
Moses
the Jewish
Mendelssohn
tradition, and
rzucił
in
nam
the world
przesłanie,
which is
że
open
życie
to
w obu
us as
światach, w
the
świecie
citizens of our
żydowskim,
country, is
tradycji
something not
żydowskiej,
only
w
possible, but
świecie,
something
który
that
jest
we should
otwarty dla
want.
nas, dla
That if
obywateli
you
swojego
are a Jew
królestwa,
who lives in
jest
Germany
nie
or in
tylko
French, if you've
możliwy,
been
jest
emancipated, you
wspominane
have your civic
w
rights, that's
jakimś
great,
państwie,
because you
w
can be
Polsce, w
the
Niemczech, we
citizen of your
Francji.
country, and at the
Jeżeli ma
same time
prawa
a Jew who
obywatelskie,
continues
no
their
to będzie
Jewish life,
bezbronny. Jeżeli on
who's
będzie
still
działał
engaged
w
in Jewish
państwie
tradition. So
obywatelskim
he
czy
believes
państwie,
that religious practices
jednocześnie
and his
tym,
German
który
identity
kontynuuje
are
życie
not
żydowskie z tradycją
contradictory,
żydowską.
that a Jew
I on
can
wierzył,
live
że
according to the
spełniając
Jewish
prawa
law,
religijne nie
at the
będzie
same time
naruszał
not
morału.
renouncing
Nie są
enlightenment,
sprzeczne, że
still
Żyd może
benefiting
żyć
from the
zgodnie z
culture,
żydowskim
from
prawem,
all the
nie
benefits that we
rezygnując
have
z
around us.
poświęcenia, ze
For
wszystkich
example, if you have
kultur,
the
kultury,
possibility to
które
study
nas
in the
otaczają. Czy
university
jeżeli
or the
możemy
chance to
zarabiać,
vote,
studiować na
then why should we give
uniwersytecie,
up on that?
dlaczego odmawiać
We no
sobie
longer have to live
studiowania
in
na
a
uniwersytecie? Jeżeli
society
możemy
that's
głosować w swoim
closed.
państwie, dlaczego odmawiać sobie w tym? Nie musimy już teraz mieszkać w społeczeństwie zamkniętym. I jeszcze przypomnę kilka punktów, które dawały nam te punkty bardzo ważne, o których mówiliśmy, które dotyczą emancypacji. Mówiliśmy
So
o
we discussed
Napoleonie,
the most
o tym,
important
że
events
Europa
related to
Zachodnia
emancipation. We talked about
bez nich
Napoleon,
istnieje wiele
that in
ograniczeń
Western
wobec
Europe
Żydów.
he
Mówiliśmy o tym, że
removed
raptem w czasie,
many
kiedy monarchia powraca w XIX
limitations
wieku, to te
from
ograniczenia
Jews.
wracają.
But then, during the
Ale mówiliśmy,
counter-revolution,
że w
many of the
innych częściach Europy Zachodniej, w Niemczech, w Austro-Węgrii, we Włoszech, z każdym krokiem do przodu Żydzi otrzymują prawa, prawa obywatelskie. Kiedy człowiek ma prawa obywatelskie, to raptem staje się przed wyborem. Kiedy człowiek ma wybór, i to jest piękne, to jest coś, co zasadniczo jest w naszej tradycji. Kiedy otwieramy Torę, to Tora nam mówi
So
zawsze,
when we
że jest
open the
wybór, że
Torah,
Bóg
it
stworzył
tells
człowieka,
us
że
that we
Bóg
have a
stworzył
choice, and this is
człowieka, który
something
ma
beautiful in
wybór.
our tradition. The
Mówi
Torah
nam
tells us
wybierać
that
dobro.
God
Nie
has
mówi
created
nam,
people who
że
have a
człowiek jest
choice, who can
programowany jak
choose
maszyna
to do
i
what is
tylko robi
good,
to,
that
co robi. Więc
they
kiedy mamy wybór,
have a choice.
kiedy mamy emancypację,
It-
kiedy mamy prawa,
So when we
to
have
wtedy przed nami wiele
emancipation, when we
opcji.
have rights, then we have many different options.
Tradycyjne wierzenie i
So the
praktyki
first
można
option is that
poniewielkiemu
traditional beliefs and
dostosowaniu
practices
zharmonizować z
can be,
integracją
after a small
poprzez nowoczesny,
adjustment,
neutralny przekaz w
harmonized with
społeczeństwie.
the integration with the modern,
Czyli nie
neutral
mówi nam się o tyle
lay
o reformie jeszcze
society.
w tej opcji.
So
Opcja
here we
pierwsza
don't
mówi
talk
jedynie
about
o
reform yet.
lekkiej
It just
integracji.
talks about
Okej,
this
ale
small
jednocześnie
integration.
pojawia się
But at the
inny
same time, we have a
odrzucenie
different
wszelkich
idea.
sugestii dotyczących
So
modernizacji,
renouncing all the
integracji
suggestions
jako
about
zagrażających tradycji.
integration and
Czyli każda
changes as
integracja,
something that
każde
threatens the
nauczanie się czegoś
tradition.
nowego
So
jest
this view says
zagrożeniem.
that any changes,
Gdybyśmy
learning of
wyobrażyli
anything
historię
new is a
prawdziwego
threat to
człowieka
our
z
tradition.
językiem sofer, który mówi nam nie,
Then there was
Hadash Asur
this man called
Letorah,
Sofer who
czyli
said
nowe
no,
jest
that
zakazane
everything
Torą.
that is new has been
Dlaczego tak
prohibited
mówi?
by the Torah.
Zagrożenie
So
tradycji, jak
why
on
is
widzi,
he saying that?
stanowi
That
wszystko, co
everything which is
wstąpi.
new is a
Ale
threat
tak
to
naprawdę
the
to jest
tradition.
najbardziej nowe zdanie, które
But
widzimy w
actually,
tradycji
this
żydowskiej
is
na
one of the
przestrzeni
newest
tysiący
positions
lat.
that we see in the
Dlaczego?
Jewish
Ponieważ
tradition over the
tradycjonalistwo
course
nie
of
mogłoby
1,000 years.
istnieć
And
bez
that's
zmian.
because Jewish tradition could
Jeżeli
not
by w
exist
pewnym
without changes.
kierunku nie poszliśmy, to byśmy nie
So
zbudowali w
if
ogóle
we
państwa. Nie byłoby ani
wouldn't have
królów
gone in a
judańskiego,
specific direction, we
nie
wouldn't have
byśmy
had
mieli,
anything, the
nie
society, we
zbudowalibyśmy
wouldn't have had
imperium,
King
nie
David,
zbudowalibyśmy
we
państwa.
wouldn't
Jeżeli
have
by w pewnym
built
punkcie zwrotnym historii
states
nie
and
nauczylibyśmy
towns.
się żyć bez świątyni,
At
kiedy
a
była
certain point, we were
wreszcie
forced to
wieku
learn how to
nowej
live
ery,
without the temple, which was
to
destroyed in the
jakby
first
wyglądał
century
judaizm?
of
Czy
Common
rozproszeni
Era.
w ogóle
So
nie
if we
znaleźlibyśmy czegoś,
hadn't made
jakiejś,
that change, then
jakiegoś środka?
what would have
A
happened to
naprawdę pojawiają
Judaism?
się
It
rabini,
would have been
potem
dispersed
pojawia się
without
tradycja,
this
którą otrzymaliśmy, czy
center.
przekazujemy
But
od
then
pradziadów
suddenly
i
the
otrzymaliśmy
rabbis
ją.
appeared,
Miszne,
and we
Talmud.
had the tradition from
Wszystko
the
zostało
Pharisees, we had the Mishnah, the
zbudowane ze
Talmud,
słów.
and
Jak gdyby
everything was
mieliśmy
built out
świątynię
of
zbudowaną
words.
ze słów.
So we
Nie
had a temple that
mamy
was built out of
żadnych
words because
korbanitów,
suddenly
nie
we
mamy
did not
ofiar.
have any
Co wtedy robić,
korbanot,
jeżeli
any sacrifices.
Co wtedy robić,
So
jeżeli nie
then
mamy
what do you
ofiar?
do if you don't have
Mówili nam
any
tradycja czysta,
sacrifices?
to niech
So the
modlitwa
oral
będzie
tradition
ofiarą.
tells us
Tak?
that,
Więc
okay, so now
odrzucenie
prayer will be the sacrifice.
modernizacji nigdy nie
So
było częścią tradycji
renouncing
żydowskiej.
modernization
Tradycja
was never a
żydowska stała
part
się
of Jewish tradition. It was always
tego, co się
adjusting
dzieje
to
w
what was
świecie.
happening around the world.
Kolejna nasza idea jest z jednej
And
strony
another new
pozbawiony
idea
ideologii, ale
is
praktyczny system.
that we could
Prostych,
have a system
osobistych
without an
kompromisów. Czyli
ideology,
nie
a
mamy
practical system
jednego
regarding
wspólnego
some
zdania
simple
albo
personal
czego
compromises. So
przestrzegać,
we
co
don't have
nie,
one
ale
mm,
szukamy
set of
kompromisu. Na
rules
przykład
regarding what should be done.
mówimy,
We look for a
przetrzymajmy
compromise. Let's say
wszystko, ale tak po
we
cichu
say,
tego,
okay,
żeby
we'll
spotkać
be
gdzieś tam
um,
w Niemczech
practicing
w
Shabbat,
wieku
but maybe
powiedzmy
somewhere
XVIII
we
czy
will
XVII i
open
powiemy,
up our
zauważyliśmy,
store somewhere
ponieważ
in
któraś klient
Germany, and
albo
we'll say,
poszliśmy
well,
do
we
synagogi,
opened it
ale
because
to
we
była
were waiting
osobista
for our
decyzja,
customers,
nie
or
przez
we
to,
didn't go to
że
the
ktoś nam
synagogue, but it
powiedział,
was
czy
our
ktoś sam
personal
zawołał, a po prostu nie
decision,
poszliśmy.
not imposed on us.
Musiałam
We simply
pójść na
decided
ulicę.
not to go
Tak?
because,
Czyli
let's say, I had to go to the
nie ma
university.
ideologii, nie ma
So
czegoś
there is no
wspólnego.
ideology, no
Jeszcze
common set
jeden
of rules.
wariant, jedna z
And
sugestii, rezygnacja.
another option
Rezygnacja z
is
judaizmu,
simply
co też
renouncing, giving up on
szybko, ale
Judaism.
było
And
rozpowszechnione.
this may be
Ponieważ jeżeli
sad, but it
mamy
was a quite
czegoś, co
widespread
będzie
option, because if
jednoczyć
we don't have
świat
something that will be
tradycji,
unifying
które
the
raptem
world of
zostaje
tradition,
w
which
przeszłości,
suddenly
świat,
becomes
który
something small,
walczył
something
przed
in the
nami,
past,
jeżeli nie
and on
mamy
the other hand, we have this
tego
whole world
środka,
opening
nie
for
mamy
us
tego
in the future.
mostu,
So if
to
we don't
bardzo
have
wielu
this middle
ludzi
ground, this
religijnych
bridge,
postanowili, ok,
then many learned,
jeżeli religia
educated people
jest jedynym
said, okay,
sposobem
if
na
religion
to,
is
żeby
just
przetrwać
a
w swoim
way to
życiu i
survive
nie
in
ma
your
w nim
life,
już czegoś naprawdę
and
istotnego,
you don't
to
really have anything
przestańmy być
essential in
ludźmi
it, then let's
religijnymi,
stop
ale
being
nikt nie
religious
wymaga,
people.
żebyśmy
But if the
zostali się
state
chrześcijanami i
requires us
czekajmy
to
od
become
niezależnego
Christians, then
Boga,
okay, well,
ale
we
niech
don't
będzie.
believe
Tak?
in it,
Tak, albo można było
but
przetrwać.
okay,
I
so
niestety
be it if
wielu
that
takich
will
Żydów.
allow us to
I
survive.
niestety
So
jest
unfortunately, you
nas
had
wiele z
many
przykładów.
such
To jest
Jews And one of the examples is the son of Moses Mendelssohn himself, who converted to Christianity, and his son, Felix Mendelssohn, the renowned composer,
to jest ich historia. Oni
that was
przeszli nasz
his
ślad.
history, that he
Ale kiedy
converted to
właśnie
Christianity, and
przejdziemy
many others did so as
do
well.
naszego tematu,
And now we are
ten
moving into
kolejny
our
wariant,
topic, the
modyfikacja
yet
tradycyjnych
another
wierzeń
option, so the modification
żydowskich,
of
aby
traditional
ułatwić
Jewish
integrację
beliefs and
w
practices
otaczającym
to make it
społeczeństwie.
easier to integrate with
Właśnie
the
na
surrounding
tym
society.
polega idea i
So that
powstanie
was the
reformy
idea and
judaizmu.
the emergence of reform in
Kiedy mówimy
Judaism.
o reformach i szukamy pierwszego
So, if
miejsca,
we talk
kiedy
about
one
reform and we
zaczynają się,
want to pinpoint the first
wtedy
place where it all
jednym z
started,
najbardziej ważnych
then
punktów jest Amsterdam.
Amsterdam
W
is
wieku
one of the most important
XVIII-XVIII.
places at the end
Tutaj
of the
znajdziemy
18th century.
Kehilat
Here
Adat
we have
Yeshurun,
Kehilat Adat Yeshurun,
czyli gminę, która z początku była grupą, która
so a
odłączyła się
community. At
od
first, it was
tradycyjnej,
a group that
oficjalnej gminy żydowskiej w
detached itself
Amsterdamie.
from the official
Dlaczego odłączyła się?
Jewish community in
Dlatego,
Amsterdam.
aby zrozumieć to, musimy
And
troszkę
why did
zobaczyć
it
tło
separate from it?
historyczne.
Well, let's look at it
Kiedy
from a
spojrzymy
historical
sobie na tło
context.
historyczne, co się
So,
dzieje w
what was
tych czasach
happening in
w
those
Amsterdamie,
times?
to w
So, in
795 roku
1795,
armia
the French
francuska zajęła
army
Niderlandy,
conquered the
tworzy
Netherlands and
swoją
it
republikę,
created its own republic,
która jest
which
sojusznikiem
was the
Francji w
ally of
wojnie przeciwko
France
Wielkiej
in the
Brytanii, ale
war
oznaczała
against
też
Great
harmonię
Britain.
i
So that
kulturą,
means that
i
it
nauki, i tradycyjne,
also
wszystko na wzór francuski. I
absorbed,
na wzór
imposed all the
francuski
practices, history,
ogłasza
culture based on the French one.
deklarację praw
So
człowieka.
then the French
I
announced the
tak,
Declaration of
widzimy,
Human
że
Rights.
Żydzi, zaczynając od
So starting from
1796 roku,
1796, Jews
otrzymują równe
received
prawa
equal
obywatelskie.
civic
Na ten
rights.
czas, kiedy spojrzymy sobie na gminę żydowską w Niderlandach, to
So in
liczy ona
those times,
50 tysięcy
the
osób,
Jewish community in the
z
Netherlands
czego
had
połowa
around
mogłyby być w
50,000
Amsterdamie,
people, and
w
half
jednym
of them
mieście. I
were in
jest
Amsterdam,
to
so in
miasto w
one
tych czasach,
city.
które
In
było
those times,
największym
that
skupiskiem
was
Żydów w
the
Europie.
place where the largest
Tak?
number of Jews in Europe lived.
W Amsterdamie, z wyjątkiem 3000
So in
osób,
Amsterdam, with the exception of
Amsterdamczycy
3,000 people,
żydowscy
the rest
byli
of Jews in
z Aszkenazu,
Amsterdam came from
mówili
Ashkenaz,
w
so
języku
they
jidysz.
spoke in Yiddish.
Żydzi aszkenascy, gdzie by się nie osiedlili, czy w Polsce, czy w Amsterdamie,
So
to mówili
Jews
w
from
swoim języku,
Ashkenaz
który był bardziej bliski
spoke their
temu,
own
co było w
language,
języku
which
jidysz.
was close to German in
I
Yiddish,
wtedy
regardless of where
gmina
they settled, whether in Poland or
żydowska,
Amsterdam.
większość jej
And back
członków
then, most of
byli
the members of the
ludzie
Jewish
ubogi.
community
I
were people
kierowała
who
tą
were
gminą
quite poor.
grupka zamożnych
And you
osób,
had
parnasów.
a group of
Parnasy po
affluent
hebrajsku
people, the
to
Parnassus.
jest
Le Parnes
ubezpieczanie
means
finansowe,
to
finansować.
secure, to
Tak?
finance.
I
Those were the people who
wiadomo,
were
że jeżeli
running the
jest grupa
community.
osób, którzy
So,
finansują
if you
wszystko,
have
no
a
to
group
mają
who's financing
przywileje,
everything, then
mają
they have their
samochód,
privileges.
strój i w takim środowisku, w takim tle, po
So, in
francuskim
such
podboju
a
powstała
place,
raptem
in
młoda
this
grupa
context, after the
żydowska.
French conquest,
Ludzi
suddenly you
wykształconych,
have a
ludzi,
young
którzy
Jewish
chcieli
group of
wprowadzać
educated
zmiany
people
w duchu
who wanted
rewolucji
to introduce
francuskiej,
changes in the
ponieważ
spirit of
tradycja
the French Revolution,
historioznawcze nie
because
możemy
Jewish tradition
oddzielić
and
od
history cannot
tradycji,
be
która
separated
jest
from the
dookoła.
surrounding
Więc
tradition and
wraz z
environment.
kilkoma
So, with a
nieżydowskimi
couple of
intelektualistami
non-Jewish
studiowali
intellectuals,
razem,
they would
stwarzali swoje
study together,
stowarzyszenie
and then they
profrancuskie,
established their own
otwarte,
pro-French society
niezależne.
association, which
I
was
ta grupa
very courageous,
działała na
open,
rzecz
independent,
emancypacji w tych
and this
czasach.
group is
I
promoting
postawił sobie
emancipation
za
in those
cel
times. And
reformę
their goal
modlitwy.
was to
O co tutaj
reform
im
the
chodzi?
prayer.
Mówią zniesienie
So they
pijutów.
said, let's do
Dlaczego
away
zniesienie
with
pijutów? Czym
piyutim.
jest w ogóle
Why? What is
pijut?
a
Jest to
piyut?
poezja liturgiczna.
This is
Z
liturgic
czasem
poetry.
to jest trochę śmieszne, ale kiedy
And
odważnie
this may
odkrywamy
seem a
Hesydut,
little bit funny, but Nowadays, when we open a Siddur, they are completely different from the ones from a couple of 100 years ago because every generation is adding something, but they do not throw away anything. So then you have prayers which are important, but then you have some liturgical poetry, some changes, additions, which are also there. So the Siddur keeps on expanding. And now suddenly every person who wants to pray would have to spend a couple of hours on each service. And this could be shortened if you would just distill the most essential parts. So this group said that we have too much of these non-essential elements which were later additions. So let's abbreviate this so that people can really focus on the most essential prayers to make sure that this is a really genuine prayer. Some prayers had content that could be frowned upon by the authorities. For example, if we live next to Christians, then why should we recite prayers that come from the early Middle Ages? So from times when you had all the wars, when you had all the conflicts, why recite the prayers who speak negatively about Christians, but also due to the earlier generations? If now we are living together on one street, then why should we be saying that? On the one hand, why say it if we live next to each other, and also why say it if we live in a state where those in power are Christians? We should not try to instigate conflicts, but rather to lower the temperature. So on the one hand, this community wanted to exist as the only one, the official one, but then they failed to introduce these changes. So 21 members of the association said, okay, so we are leaving, we are separating, we'll establish our own community in which we will introduce our new ideas of emancipation, of education, the ideas that changes are necessary. So this new community secured a rabbi, a synagogue, a shohet, a mikvah, a cemetery. It provided all of that to its members. So it's called Adat Yeshurun. This was the new community because it introduced certain innovations. For example, as we already said, the authorities asked not to bury someone on the same day, but just to wait. Maybe it was also due to the fact that you had certain illnesses that made it difficult to establish with certainty if someone actually died or not. The traditional rabbis were against that, whereas the new ones said, okay, if this is what you need nowadays, then okay, so be it. So on the one hand, it's introducing changes, but on the other one, it's still a traditional one. It's abbreviated the Siddur, but nonetheless is still using the same prayer book. It is introducing some changes, but it's trying to find halachic explanations as to why such changes are introduced. So the community started to expand. You had something like 100 families. And you start to have many disputes and conflicts between the old and the new community. So the old one is accusing the new one that they are violating norms of tradition, and even marriages between the members of the two communities were prohibited. And what's interesting, they start to publish their own bulletins, and they would discuss with each other in these bulletins. They were writing in Yiddish, and both sides were publishing such materials. And some say that this is one of the first such periodic in written in Yiddish. So the one side said that reforms are bad, whereas the other side said that reforms are necessary in order to make sure that the new educated generation doesn't move away from Judaism. And the rabbi of this new community was Rabbi Itzhak Granboom. It's an interesting person. He was of Swedish origin. He was the rabbi in Amsterdam in the new community. Some say that he was a convert. I don't know. I think maybe they are emphasizing that to emphasize that he's not one of us. Although this is against Jewish tradition because it's prohibited to remind the converts that they were not Jewish in the past. So the traditional community is presenting this rabbi as a free spirit, but this is not a compliment. It's meant to describe someone who is just pretending to be a religious Jew. And the whole community was presented as the community of Korach. We may recall from our tradition, from the Torah, that Korach was someone who, let's say, became the opposition to Moses. And, well, it didn't end well. Zera Itzhak, the book authored by this rabbi, were saying that it's a bad book. So it was a difficult situation. The son of this rabbi also published additional publications where it was called Meish Yotzer, and he would also say that all these accusations are irrelevant. And if this reminds us the situation in the 21st century, then that's true. No matter how many years pass by, we still continue the same disputes. But if you look at the changes introduced by this new community, it's quite interesting, but they were not really deep changes. The members of Adat Yerushun pray from a traditional Siddur. The Rabbi Itzhak, introduced certain changes, but they were not so significant. For example, some less important parts of the service were removed, and he explained why. He said he wants to make sure that all those praying can focus on the most essential prayers, right? The most essential ones are the Shema and the Amidah, and not hundreds of piyutim. So he said, if you have things that keep on repeating themselves or are not so essential, then let's abbreviate them to make sure that the service doesn't last 3 hours, because everyone has to work. Merchants, for example, but everyone. And then he said that if you decide to recite a piyut, then make sure you pronounce everything correctly. Don't just like go through it quickly. And he also changed the character of the sermon. And this is quite interesting. This is a group that separated itself from a group that was of Ashkenazi origin. But in the Ashkenazi tradition, there was this custom that the Shabbat sermon was something resembling a lesson when everyone could participate, say something. Whereas in the Sephardi tradition, the congregants would just listen in silence. So when he introduced such a change, it was a change for Ashkenazi Jews, but not so much for Sephardi Jews, because this was based on the Sephardi practice. And another change that he introduced, I believe it's quite an ethical one, because he abolished the selling of Aliyot LeTorah. Before, if someone wanted to go up to the Torah and read from the Torah scroll, and this is the greatest honor. It was reserved for the most respected members of the community, and anyone could just buy it during an auction. So our rabbi said, no, we won't be doing that. We won't be selling religious. We won't be selling various positions. So these were maybe more aesthetic changes. These were corrections which, on the one hand, were inspired by the Sephardi community from the same city, although they stuck to the Ashkenazi pronunciation. But while they saw the Sephardi community, they saw something they liked, so they introduced such changes. And the only ideological change was the removal of a couple of prayers. For example, Av Harahamim. This is a prayer who is asking for revenge on other nations. So here we can sense that emancipation says, okay, we won't be talking about revenge on other nations. We won't be asking God to harm other nations. So this is the first organized attempt to change practices in the synagogue. That was something absolutely new back then. This is not Reform Judaism yet, but it's a basis for that, or an example. And now going back to emancipation, Napoleon called for the assembly of notables, the Grand Sanhedrin, to understand the position of Jews in the state. And we read examples of some questions and answers. For example, if would a Jew go serve in the military? Would Jews protect France? Do they believe that France is their motherland, is their state? And then there was a decree on March 17th, 1808, when he organized a new system, a consistorial system, you may call it. So just to explain it in simple terms. So they decided that Jews cannot be a separate state within the state, that if we want to have civic rights, we cannot be separated from all the others. So he decided that you need to have one body who will be a religious organ who will be responsible for the Jewish community. So, for example, the rabbis will be nominated through this system. And this body will make sure that all the services are performed in a good way. It will make sure that Jews are loyal citizens of their state. So this was most important for Napoleon, that Jews have to serve in the army, that they cannot live as a separate nation. They cannot be separated from the whole state. So if you live in France and if you want to have civic rights, you have to be a citizen. And now religion and nationality start to be two separate things. So according to this decree, you had departments, each with 2,000 Jews, and each such department can establish their own body, a consistory. And then rules were formulated as to who can establish such a body, who can be nominated to it. So as to this community in Amsterdam, Adat Yeshurun, their members participated in the Sanhedrin in Paris as observers, but then after the rabbi of Adat Yeshurun died, the situation in that country changed. So the new king, on the one hand, ordered the unification of the communities. There is like this declaration based on the French one, and then Adat Yeshurun became part of one consistory. So some of the leaders are from Adat Yeshurun, but we had this one community where you had changes in customs, in the prayers, and it was decided that they would not be continued. So after Napoleon was no longer ruling, all the changes were reversed. So when they introduced the system in France, it was also introduced in other countries who were following the French laws.
W kolejnych miastach i państwach wprowadzono bezpośrednią lub pośrednią kontrolę Francji i wtedy w tych czasach
So these countries were under the French authorities, and then you had these bodies with Jewish leadership, and here we are interested in Westphalia. So the ruler there was Hieronym Bonaparte, the younger brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, and this body was established in the same year, 1808. And here the administration of this community was quite interested in the changes. So all across its territory, it started to introduce ideas that were already present in Amsterdam, usually cultural changes. For example, they said that as you're reading the scroll of Esther, you shouldn't make all the noises because we don't want our neighbors to have a bad opinion about us, that we are some kind of savages. So these were cultural changes. So they removed everything that was destroying the harmony or the peace and quiet. For example, the custom to smash glass or a glass cup during a wedding, they also removed that because they said it may look a bit pagan and so on. Or you have this tradition where you have willow twigs during Hoshana Rabbah, the seventh day of the Sukkot festival. And they said, well, this looks a bit archaic, so let's not do that anymore. So the consistory said, no, we have to introduce changes. And Israel Jakobson was one figure who played a prominent role in Westphalia. It's an interesting figure. He was a wealthy businessman. He grew up in quite modest circumstances. He got a classical education. He was even studying to be a rabbi. He would study Latin and Greek. Then he entered into business and he became very wealthy. And this actually influenced our history as a whole. So he was born in a small town in Germany. He undertook philanthropic activities. So he grew up in modest conditions,
ze względu na to, że poziom szkół w jego mieście był tak niski,
but the
uczył się
level of
bardzo
schools in his
dobrze
town was
i
very low.
rozwijali
But
tradycje
he was a very good student. He
żydowskie,
was
hebrajskie.
studying
Nauczył
the
się
Jewish
bardzo
language,
dużo
Jewish
o prawie o
traditions, and he
halasie.
learned a lot about halaha,
Jednocześnie
about the laws.
mieszkał w wolnych czasach,
And
więc
he lived in
samodzielnie mógł wiele studiować.
free times, so
Studiował
he was
literę
able to
niemiecką.
study. He
Znalazł
would
bardzo wielu
study German
przyjaciół
literature. He made a lot of friends.
ze wszystkiego, z różnych krańców społeczeństwa. I zazwyczaj byli to ludzie
And
bardzo,
these were
bardzo bogaci.
people from various walks of life,
Kiedy
but usually
wieku
very
18
wealthy
lat był
people.
dorosłym i
So
zgromadził pełną
when he was
fortunę, dużo
18,
zarobił,
he
to
already
zdecydował się na
accumulated a lot of
małżeństwo. Umówił
wealth.
się też na
He
bardzo
decided to
kobiecie,
marry. He
córce
also
bardzo
married a very
zamożnej
wealthy
i wtedy
woman who was the
właśnie
daughter of a very wealthy
zaczął
man.
przewracać się w kołach super
And
bogatych,
then
nawet
he was
księci
part of
niemieckich.
some very
I
wealthy,
wtedy
affluent
załapał nawet
circles,
pierwszy
even of
medal, który miał
German
swój
aristocracy.
majątek i swoje
So he had
fundycje
his
i prawo
wealth, his
mocy.
money, he had influence,
Wszystko mówi o nim dużo.
he had
Ale
an important voice,
najciekawsze
and
jest
this was all important.
jego przekonania, ponieważ był osobą, która chciała coś zmienić w
But what's
społeczeństwie.
important is
Zmienić dla Żydów,
his
wybudować
position
nowy
on
świat, w
many
którym
aspects. So he
będą
wanted
mieszkać
to
razem.
change something in the Jewish community.
I
He wanted to
kierując
build
się
a
przekonaniem o
community
równości,
where you would have
pluralizmie
equality, where
religijnym,
people could live together. He believed in equality and
naprzód
pluralism.
edukacji, to w roku
So, based on
1801
those
założył
principles, in
w małej gminie
1801, in a
szkołę, której
small
było dopiero
community,
40 dzieci, nie
he
tak dużo,
opened a school where you
żydowskich
had
i
only
20
40
chrześcijańskich.
Jewish
Szkoła
children
była
and
bezpłatna.
20
Szkoła
Christian
była z
children.
naczyniami. Szkoła
The
była
school was free
z
of charge. It would
toaletą
provide
czy coś takiego. Czyli mogli dzieci tam
meals
spać,
and
mieszkać, jeść.
lodging, so
Mogli
children
się
could
uczyć
stay
i
there,
mogli
sleep,
robić to
eat,
razem.
and they could study, and they would
To była
study
pierwsza
together.
podobna
And
próba.
this was
Ta,
something
którą
new,
moim
a
zdaniem
first
warto
such
kontynuować
attempt.
w
And I believe this
XXI
is
wieku, więc kiedy
something
tego już nie
worthy
ma.
of continuation in the
Ale
21st century.
ta
Unfortunately, we
idea
don't have
szybko zdobyła
something like
szeroką
that. So
renomę
this
i
community
szybko
became well
zrobiła tak,
known.
że w tej szkole było setki
And
uczniów
then
z różnych
you
miejsc
had
na świecie.
hundreds of students
I
in that school
wyraźnie
coming from
naukę.
various places, various towns.
Później toczy się coś jeszcze bardziej ciekawego.
And then something even
W
more interesting happened.
1810 roku razem ze
So in
szkołą, koło szkoły,
1810,
buduje
next to
synagogę.
the school, he
Synagoga
built
na
a
terenie szkoły.
synagogue. So it was a
I
synagogue
tam właśnie
on the
wyraża
premises of
wszystkie
the
swoje
school.
sympatie
And
do
that's
reformy
how he
monoteistyzmu.
expressed
Wprowadza hymny Bogu
his
niemieckie,
admiration for reform
wówczas
in the
wszystko było
liturgy.
jedynie
So
w
he
języku
introduced
hebrajskim.
prayers in
Hymny,
German.
które nie każdy
Before,
rozumiał.
you had
Według których
everything in
nawet jeżeli
Hebrew, and not
dzieci
everyone
rozmawiały
knew
tym językiem, ale
Hebrew.
do końca
And
nie rozumieją, jak
children were
odczytać
learning
modlitwę.
Hebrew, but they would not
Tutaj raptem
understand everything.
jest język
So it was
niemiecki.
difficult to
Tutaj
pray
wprowadza hymn
genuinely. And suddenly he introduced prayers
chórów nie
in
dla chłopców, ale wprowadza
German. He introduced a choir. Back
i
then, it was
wprowadza
still
też
a male
uczenie
choir made up
modlitw,
only of
właśnie
boys.
oprócz hebrajskiego,
And he
aramejskiego czy
introduced
hebrajskiego lub
translations of
syryjskiego,
prayers. So
wprowadza też
you
tłumaczenie
had Hebrew, you had
języka
Aramaic, so the things you
niemieckiego.
had before, but he also
I
introduced the
właśnie wtedy
German elements.
skraca
And
nabożeństwo.
he abbreviates
Kazanie
the
zaczynają
services.
mówić w języku
The
niemieckim.
sermon is
Chór
preached
organ,
in German.
organ
You
brzmi
have
jak
a
brawa
choir, you have
niemieckie
an organ, and
kościołowe. I na
you do
ten
not
temat
have a mechitza.
konkretnego
This is very
rodzaju
interesting because suddenly you do
uniformizowania
not have
i
this concrete
rozpoznania. Nawet jeżeli
separation
osoby
between men and
usiądą
women.
oddzielnie, myślą, że
Even
tak
if
naprawdę
they were
mówią po
sitting
niemiecku.
separately, and I believe
Ale
that's how it
nie ma
was at
czegoś,
the
co
beginning, you
nie
do
daje
not
im
have
nawet
this
zobaczyć jeden
physical
drugiego.
separation that made
I
it
też
impossible for them to
zaczyna
look at one
korzystać z innej
another.
wymowy.
And he also
Nie
uses a different
aszkenazyjskiej, hebrajskiej,
pronunciation,
tylko
not the
sfaradzkiej.
Ashkenazi one,
I
but the
kiedy
Sephardi
przykładów
one
takich
in
uczniów
Hebrew.
mieli też
And to give one example, so Shabbat versus Shabbos.
Do przykładu, ale to jest chyba najbardziej znany przykład. Więc budynek ten też został ciekawie sprojektowany.
This building was designed in an interesting way because the person, the leader, was standing at the front of the room, not in the center. So he even changed the architecture of the synagogue. He wanted to make it easier for the congregation. I don't want to say it would resemble churches, but it was kind of similar to the structure, architecture of churches. And well, the reactions were not too positive. So after Napoleon lost his power in 1815, so after the fall of Napoleon, he had to move to Berlin. So when he moved to Berlin, he opened a synagogue in his own home. So he had his private minyan. He again introduced a choir and organs. You had a non-Jew who would play the organs during Shabbat and festivals. So even when Israel Jacobson was thinking about reforms, he is still respecting the halacha. So he said it's no problem for a non-Jew to provide beautiful music by playing on instruments. You had shorter sermons in German.
Że jak wraca tam rząd pruski, pamiętał jego sympatiach.
But then you had the Prussian government there, and they would receive complaints from Orthodox rabbis. They remembered his sympathies, and they said, this was someone who liked Napoleon, so let's close down his synagogue. So you had like two forces coming against him. And at the same time, the ideas of reformers from Berlin approached another big city, Hamburg, a free city. In those times, it was the home of the largest Jewish community in Germany. So they established a new synagogue there, the Hamburg synagogue, and they called it Temple. It was dedicated in 1818. So even the name itself, how would we translate temple into Polish or English? Well, sanctuary. So this signaled a change in the ideology. So before you had changes kind of in the aesthetics, changes revolving around emancipation, but now suddenly we see a change in the name, which signaled a change in the ideology. Because for many generations, Jews were praying for the restoration of the services with the sacrifices in the temple. They were praying for the temple, the old temple, to be rebuilt, but suddenly you have this change. You say, no, we have a temple now. This is the sanctuary. Everyone can come to the sanctuary. We are no longer waiting for any radical changes. So this Israeli temple was established in 1880. And from that time, we can say that the Reform tradition was established. So what else do they change besides the name? So they are imitating the Berlin ideas. They introduce new traditions, for example, the ancient Torah reading cycle. If we use the Babylonian tradition, so we read the whole Torah in 1 year, but they said, no, let's introduce the old ancient Torah reading cycle, the one they had in Eretz Israel, and in the Jerusalem Talmud, it stated that the cycle lasted 3 years, that it takes 3 years to read the 5 books of Moses. They also shorten the service, and then they prepare their own prayer book, Sidur. It's called Seder HaAvodah, so the order of Avodah. And Avodah means praying to God, service in the name of God, service dedicated to God. So now you have the first whole Reform liturgy. And again, you did away with repetitions of piyutim, repetitions in the liturgy. You have elements in German, and as to ideology changes, we no longer wait for Messiah to come to Jerusalem. We are living right here, right now. And we don't repeat a couple of times daily about the return to Zion. Now we live as citizens of this state. So we'll be focusing on praying for something else. And they try to provide halachic arguments as to why such changes are necessary. So at that moment, they are not separating themselves from the halacha. They believe that their interpretation of the halacha and the changes are something appropriate. So that's how Reform Judaism starts. In the same year, Eliezer Lieberman publishes two brochures, and they present the halakhic basis of the liturgical changes, reforms introduced in Hamburg, and he showed that he had support of the rabbis. So it's not something completely new, it's something that has the support of rabbis, of ones who write halakhic responsa, and they prove that such changes were necessary, that they were necessary in light of the changing world. And of course, this was met with a backlash. There was a negative response to that. But nonetheless, we see a positive trend. Whereas before, the changes were quite small, even changes introduced by Jacobson or the changes in Amsterdam, then now the discussions and the justifications make this to be true reform. So you have a switch to ideological principles. So it's not just a matter of aesthetics to make it seem nicer from the viewpoint of our surroundings, but we do it because this is something we truly believe in. But in those times, you already had some very strong negative reactions. You had 40 responsa who would condemn the new temple, and they emphasized three prohibitions. So one, you cannot change the order of prayers. Second prohibition, you cannot pray in a different language than Hebrew. And it's quite interesting because even today, if we open an Orthodox Siddur in the United States or in Europe, then what do we see there? We see translations into the local language. So the changes will happen in our history, one way or the other, just that in this case they come later. So the third change, you cannot use musical instruments in synagogues during Shabbats and festivals, even if you have a non-Jew playing on them. So they decided to prohibit everything that Reform was trying to introduce. So you have this discussion in Hamburg, and this marks the start of a new era in Judaism. So it's an era that will be marked by a division of Judaism into different movements. So I often hear statements that we respect Orthodox Judaism more because thanks to that movement in Judaism, the Jewish people were able to protect their own history. But actually, you did not have orthodoxy before that. Orthodoxy appeared only as an answer to the changes, an answer to emancipation. It was something introduced to make sure that Jews do not convert to Christianity, that they do not choose their separate way, so as not to have this black and white view, all or nothing approach, so that people can maintain their Jewish identity, Jewish identification, but to make sure that at the same time they can study, they can go to school, to university, that they can work along with non-Jews. So that's what we see today in the modern world. So if you have Orthodox Jews in the United States and so on, this all exists today as well. But in those times when it was just starting, this led to some very strong discussions. So I'd like to emphasize that these changes were actually not so radical, that all that we've discussed was not radical. We don't see any women rabbis. We don't see any violations of traditions. So this was the beginning. So I decided to divide this topic into a couple of separate sessions so that we can follow step by step how this change happened and what were the reactions to this change and how all this affects the way we think today and how it translates into the politics and the policy of modern Israel. So this all stems from these events. So thank you very much.